The last thing that we need to do to complete this topiary is to add leaves, apply some simple shaders, and then get a final render out. And we will be accomplishing this with a particle hair system where we have several different options that vary in efficiency. If you remember in the first video when I was talking about the level of detail that you might need, where if your topiary is in the background, why go through all this effort? You wouldn't need to do that. You can simply apply a particle hair system to the model itself and not worry about the vines. You can use strands instead of instanced leaf geometry, where the strands are much more efficient and will save you some render time. But since those are either tubes or flat planes, it won't look like a leaf. It'll look like an approximation or a stylistic leaf. But from the beginning, I said that this was going to be the highest level of detail that you would probably ever want from a topiary. So I'm going to be using instanced leaf geometry. And first thing to do is to create that. So let's jump over to an empty layer. And I'm going to first set up an image plane from a top-down view. Hit number pad 7 and 5 to go to orthographic top view. And let's see, enable background images. Let's choose add image. And then for the axis, this will be from the top. And let's open our image, which I have in the texture folder because I'll also be using this as the leaf texture. And it's called leaves PNG. That will be included in the source files. And this will give us something to model from. So I will add a mesh plane. And let's rename this leaf A. Tab into, before I tab into edit mode, let's move the object so that the origin, that orange dot in the middle, lines up with the end of our leaf. There we go. Now I will tab into edit mode and move my elements around, the vertices in particular, and just start to outline my leaf shape. And I want to keep this as simple as possible because each polygon that I can save will save me render time. So I'll just continue drawing a polygon outline around my leaf. And I don't care about triangles or quads necessarily. I just want to create the simplest and most efficient form. There we go. Now select everything and hit Control N to make our normals consistent. And maybe I'll cut an edge right there with Control J, or just J, no Control, because again, I don't care about triangles. And now that I have the shape modeled laying flat here, let's give it some dimension, because without the dimension, there's no point to modeling a leaf. I might as well just use a flat plane. And let's move the center point down. Start to create this arc. Then let's move down the stem. There we go, something like that. Move up our geometry because I want the stem to line up with the origin because this is where our particles are going to grow from. So let's just continue with the leaf shape. There we go. I think that is good enough. And so that's the first leaf. Now I will duplicate this and move it over in the X direction. Line up our origin in object mode with the stem of the image below. Tab into edit mode. And let's move these points to better match up with our leaf underneath. There we go. I think that's about as good as it'll get, though I have a triangle in here that's not filled. Let's fill that on both. And maybe vary up our shapes a bit. Enable connected proportional editing. And let's move this side down, perhaps. Just make it a little bit different. And now might as well go lay out our UVs. So from a top orthographic view, using 7 and 5 on the number pad, I will split my window and make this left side the UV image editor and get rid of our tool and view properties panel. And in edit mode, select all of my mesh components, hit U in the viewport and choose project from view. And over here, we'll see our UVs as they are projected directly from our viewport. And let's choose the leaves.png texture image. And then we can simply scale this UV island up to match the appropriate leaf. Maybe move these points around just a bit, though disable proportional editing. There we go. And do the same thing to the other one. Tab into edit mode, select everything you project from view, and then scale this up, make it match the underlying image. Very nice. Now our leaves are finished. I can select both of them though, and let's see here. In my object tools, let's go ahead and smooth the shading. And let's see, perhaps select everything in edit mode and hit Control N to reunify the normals. Do the same thing on the other one. And for our second leaf, let's rename it to leaf B. And then select both leaves, Control G to create a group. And in our object properties, we'll scroll down to the groups drop-down menu, and let's rename this to be leaves, because we'll be using this group to randomly populate our particle hair system. And this is a pretty common particle hair portion of the tutorial. If you've seen the Piero course, then you'll be very familiar with this workflow. But now that we have the texture applied and our UVs laid out, we can get rid of the UV image editor. And while I have these guys selected, let's go ahead and add a new material. But first jump into the Cycles render engine, new material, and let's call it leaves. And then while both of them are selected in the drop-down arrow options, I can choose copy material to others, and then go ahead and quickly set up this material. Jump over to the node editor, and with Shift A, add input texture coordinate, because we will be using that image that we modeled from. Shift A, texture, image texture, plug up our UV coordinates to the vector, and then choose the leaves image that we have linked into this blend file. And then the color goes into the color of our diffuse. Though if we look at our preview, you can see that there's all this black space that we want to cut out. We can do that with a shader, transparent shader, and then mix that with our diffuse in the right way. So add a mix shader. And let's plug our transparent into the first slot of the mix shader node, and then take the alpha from our image texture, because this is a PNG with an alpha. And if we plug that into the factor, you'll see that all the black area gets cut out. And that's the basic setup for our leaf material, but I'm sure I'll have to address that later. Okay, so now that we've got our leaves created, we can go back to layer 1. And so again, back to our options, I can do several things. I know that I don't want to grow leaves from our internal branches, so we can just turn that off in the viewport. But here I can do a mixture of either growing leaves from the actual model itself and simply not rendering the model, but only its particle system, or I can grow leaves from just the external branches. And when I was exploring this, I actually did a mixture between the two, because growing leaves from the model will give you a higher fidelity to the shape, but growing leaves from the branches will give you that more natural, not so perfect look. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to grow from the external branches. So we will keep the model turned off, also turn off its renderability while we're at it. And just a fair warning here, as you can tell, the viewport is actually running really smoothly, but we do have a lot of geometry to deal with concerning this network of branches. So just be aware that our viewport is going to slow down a lot. So much so that I'm going to rely on actual rendering with Cycles, because Cycles can handle a lot of geometry, and it'll be faster to just go from render to render, tweaking my particles along the way rather than try and do it in the viewport. So this is just the way that I want to go. I want this thing to be extremely detailed, and in order to achieve that detail, you have to work around the technical limitations sometimes. So in order to add a particle system, since this is a curve object, we can't actually add particles. I've got to convert this to a polygon mesh. And I can do that with Alt-C and choose Mesh from Curve /Meta/Surf/Text. And this will give me a polygon object where now I can add a particle system. But keep in mind, it might be a good idea to duplicate the branch's external before we converted it. So in case we ever needed to edit that in the future, we could easily access that. But I'm not worried about that for this project. I'm very happy with my branches, and I will just move forward as a polygon mesh. Let's add a new particle system. I'll name this leaves. And then I'll also rename the particle settings leaves _ PS. I like to make those relate to one another. And the type is going to be hair. And there we go. We've got hair growing from our geometry. But clearly the hair length is way too long. So let's change that from 4 to, let's go 0.2. And yeah, I think that is a decent size. And the viewport is still responding fairly well, but that's because I haven't chosen my leaf geometry objects to instance. Now we can do that under the render tab, where path is the default. We can choose object if we want just one piece of leaf geometry, or group if we want to randomly select from within a group of geometry objects. And that's what I'll do. I'll choose leaves as my duplicate group. And right away, you'll start to notice a little bit more lag in the viewport. Still not terrible, but you know, this is just barely even a fraction of the amount of leaves that we need. But trust me, we will work up to that. And then below our duplicate group selection, we have a couple other options. I'm going to enable pick random just so that it picks randomly instead of uniformly from within the group. And in the size of 0.05, that actually looks pretty good. I think that that's a good size, maximum size for our leaves. And then random size, let's change that to 0.5. So we get randomization of the leaf sizes. And as far as I know how this works, is the size here dictates the upper end, the largest that the leaves can get, and then random size will randomly scale that down from this size. And next, let's address the number of leaves that we have. The default is 1,000. I'm just going to add a 0 to this to make it 10,000. And now you'll start to see our viewport become basically unresponsive. Yeah, now I'm just going to have to type in numbers and do a render in order to understand what my leaves are doing, which, trust me, I know is extremely inconvenient, but you know, it's a price that I'm willing to pay in order to get this extremely high detailed topiary. So I will go ahead and set up our render elements like a camera and an environment light source. And in order to navigate within my viewport, once I've added the particle system, I'm just going to simply turn it off over here in the outliner underneath modifiers. Turn that guy off. And it's still running a little bit slow, but anyway, it's because now it's polygons and it's not just a curve object. But anyway, let's add a camera. Hit 0 on the number pad to look into that camera. And now I have to zoom out. There's my camera frame. In my view properties, let's enable lock camera to view. And then I'm just going to zoom out, find a nice 3/4 angle. And then disable lock to camera. And next, let's address the environment lighting. So click New under the World tab to create a new world. And then the color is going to be an environment texture. Let's click Open, and I'll go find one from my Creative Commons library, which I will be including with the source file. So this nature one looks pretty good. And then we'll save our scene before we do a render. And then kick that off. And there we go. Those 10 samples rendered really quickly. I forgot to upgrade some of my settings. So let's jump into the render panel. Under sampling, let's make our render samples 100. And light paths, let's make our max bounces, let's go 3 and 1. And enable no caustics, we don't need those. Then scroll down to the Performance tab and change our render tiles to 32 by 32. And also make our environment transparent. Let's try rendering that again. About 35 seconds, that's really not too bad. But there's nowhere near the amount of leaves that we need. So in order to make this happen, I'm going to select the particle system and go ahead and tweak some settings. Let's increase the number from 10,000 to 100,000 just by adding a 0. And then scroll down, and let's also give it some children with the interpolated children type. And we'll leave the display at 10. That's fine. I don't really need to see the display, but I want the render to be 10 as well. And let's see what the population of that is like now. Yeah, that amount of leaves is pretty good. Though our render time is suffering a little bit more. We're at about 3 minutes right now, which really isn't a complaint from me, given how much detail is showing up in here. We can see all these little vines, which is a very realistic effect and much more authentic to how topiaries really look, at least compared to if I were simply to add this particle hair system to the model by itself without doing the underlying branch structure. So I'm pretty happy with this level of detail, but a couple things I want to add before calling this final is, number one, we need a simple material to apply to our branches. I also want to introduce some translucency to our leaves for realism's sake, and then I also need to add a sun light source. So let's quickly create our vine or a branch material. Let's create that, call it branches, and jump over to the node editor where I will also use a simple image texture. Let's go input, texture coordinate, let's see, texture, image texture node. We're going to open a new one called Tree Bark 004. And then let's use our object input because I'm going to choose box projection, which if you want to know all about this, I encourage you to see the recently added box mapping tutorial from Gleb Alexandrov. He does a great job with that. So I've switched it to box, and the blend I'll change to 0.3, and then use the color output to plug into our diffuse color input. And you can see that over here in the preview. That's it for that material. Now let's see, I'll select one of my leaves and replace our diffuse BSDF with a shader translucent BSDF and plug in our image texture and then replace the diffuse socket of our mix shader. There we go. And I might as well go ahead and add a specular component. Let's see, where are we at? Shader, glossy BSDF, and then we will mix that. Let's see, before we mix our transparent in there. So duplicate our mix shader node with Shift D, plug it in there. And then the glossy goes in the second slot. And we can see in our preview that that's way too strong. So let's bump the factor way down. Let's try 0.1, maybe even 0.05. What if we use our image texture as a bump? Let's add first a converter math node because we'll need to dial it way down and plug in our color from the image texture into value slot 1. The operation will be multiply. Let's see what a value of 0.2 will give us as far as the displacement. And let's see, it looks like it's too high. How about 0.05? Yeah, I'm getting a little too detailed. We're never going to see that detail. So anyway, we'll stop right there and finally add our light source. So jump back to the 3D view, hit Shift A, lamp, and we'll create a sun lamp. Let's put it in front of our rhinoceros and angle it towards him at a fairly horizontal angle, like an early morning sunrise or something like that. And let's see, for the size here, which will determine how soft the shadows are, I'm going to bump that up to let's go 0.3. And then our emission color, let's go into the yellow range. And also the strength, let's bump that up to 10. Now let me make sure in the UV image editor that I'm in slot 3 and do a render of this. Here we are at 7 minutes now. So adding the light with shadows certainly increased render time. There's a lot of geometry to calculate shadows for. But still, given the amount of geometry that we have in this scene, the amount of detail, I'm really quite happy and somewhat impressed with the render time. But I did forget to add our branch material to the internal branches. So let's do that and also maybe tweak the color a little bit. And also I want to add another light in the back to give us some rim lighting. So let's jump to slot 4 first. And let's jump over to the node editor, select our branches external mesh from the outliner. And I want to add a color hue saturation node, plug it in between the image texture and the diffuse BSDF. And let's bump up our saturation let's bump it way up to a level of 2. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Maybe take our value down to, let's say, 0.8. Yeah, make it a little bit darker. Now select our branches internal and choose that material, branches. Now jump to the 3D view and let's duplicate our sun lamp, Shift D, and rotate it around the 3D cursor, basically facing directly at the camera, maybe a little bit off to the side. About like that, and increase the strength to, let's say, double it to 20, and keep my fingers crossed that this is the final render. Here we are with the render time still clocking in under 10 minutes at this resolution, which I'm really happy with, even after the addition of another light source, which is giving us some very nice rim lighting effects on the edges of our leaves. And yeah, I'm happy to call this finished. There's a lot of detail in here, which is what I was after from the beginning. The structure is authentic to how a real topiary is constructed in real life. And overall, this was a fun challenge for me. So I hope you had fun with it as well. Hope you might have picked up a few things, particularly about the IvyGen add-on. I covered that in depth, so I hope you can see how to apply that at various different Ivy-related things. That's it. Thank you for watching.